Russell Wasendorf Sr. was sitting in his car in his garage in a rural part of Iowa on July 9, 2012. The engine was running. The garage door was closed. He had a detailed confession letter in his lap, an 8-page letter describing how he had stolen over $200 million from his clients over the past 20 years. He had built Peregrine Financial Group from scratch. The firm, a small commodities trading company in Cedar Falls, Iowa, had grown into a respected company managing billions of dollars for thousands of clients. It had been featured in business magazines. It had made donations to local charities. His employees loved him. His son worked with him as the company's vice president. And for 20 years, every day, Russell Wasendorf systematically stole money from the people who trusted him. Finally, when federal regulators began asking questions he couldn't answer, it all came to an end. Carbon monoxide would kill him before the FBI could catch him. He would leave behind his confession so everyone would know the truth. So his son could understand. So the victims would know they weren't to blame for trusting him. But Russell Wasendorf didn't die that morning. A paramedic found him unconscious, pulled him from the car, and saved his life. And that confession? It became the centerpiece of one of the most stunning financial fraud cases in American history. A 20-year deception so bold, so simple, so brazen that investigators couldn't believe it had worked for so long. This is the story of how a small-town Iowa businessman fooled everyone for 2 decades and nearly got away with it. The year was 1990, and Russell Wasendorf Sr. had a dream. He'd been working in the commodities trading industry for years, watching other people build successful brokerage firms. He knew the business. He understood futures contracts, agricultural commodities, financial derivatives. He had the expertise. What he didn't have was capital, or patience, or, as it would turn out, integrity. Wasendorf founded Peregrine Financial Group in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a small city of about 40,000 people, far from the financial centers of Chicago or New York. That isolation was intentional. In a small town, you were a big fish. People respected success. They didn't ask too many questions. PFG started small, handling trades for local farmers hedging their crop prices, small investors dipping into commodity futures. Wasendorf was charismatic, persuasive. He had that Midwestern trustworthiness, the firm handshake, the straight talk, the community involvement. People liked doing business with him. The company grew steadily through the early 1990s. By 1992, PFG was managing several $1 million in customer funds. Those funds were supposed to be held in segregated accounts at U.S. Bank, protected and untouchable, only used for the customer's trades. That's when Russell Wasendorf made the decision that would define the next 20 years of his life. He started stealing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a little. A few $100,000 transferred from the customer's segregated accounts to operating accounts he controlled. Money he could use for company expenses, for expansion, for his own salary and lifestyle. He told himself it was temporary, a short-term loan from customer funds that he'd pay back when business improved. Every fraudster tells themselves this lie. They all believe it at first. But here's the problem with stealing. Once you start, stopping means getting caught. The money he took created a hole in the accounts. To hide that hole, he had to show regulators that the customer funds were still there. So he did something remarkably simple. He forged the bank statements. U.S. Bank would mail monthly statements to PFG showing the actual balance in the segregated accounts, the real number, which was now missing the money Wasendorf had stolen. Before those statements reached the company's compliance department or the regulatory auditors, Wasendorf would intercept them. He'd take the real statement, white out the actual balance, type in a fake number that matched what should be there, and photocopy it. The photocopy looked official enough. Nobody checked with the bank directly. Why would they? Russell Wasendorf was the CEO, the founder, a pillar of the community. Nobody suspected he was running a forgery operation from his desk. That first year, 1992, he probably stole less than $1 million. A test, an experiment to see if anyone would notice. Nobody did. So in 1993, he took more. And in 1994, more still. By 1995, Russell Wasendorf had stolen over $5 million from customer accounts, and he'd gotten so good at forging bank statements that it took him less than an hour each month. The scheme was breathtakingly simple. No sophisticated hacking, no complex financial instruments, no offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Just whiteout, a typewriter, later a computer, and a photocopier. That's all it took to fool federal regulators for 20 years. But let's back up and understand how this was even possible. The futures trading industry is heavily regulated. The National Futures Association, NFA, conducts regular audits of firms like PFG. They're supposed to verify that customer money is protected, that firms aren't using customer funds for their own purposes. It's one of the most important safeguards in the system. Every year, NFA auditors would visit PFG. They'd request documentation showing that customer funds matched the amounts that should be in segregated accounts. Wasendorf would provide the forged bank statements. The auditors would review them, see that the numbers matched, and check the box. Audit passed. Why didn't they call the bank directly to verify? Good question. The answer is a combination of trust, procedure, and resource constraints. The NFA was auditing hundreds of firms. They relied on documentation. If the bank statements looked legitimate, they accepted them. Direct verification calls to banks happened, but not every audit, not every year. Russell Wasendorf discovered this loophole and exploited it for 2 decades. As the years went on, his theft escalated. By 2000, he'd stolen over $30 million. By 2005, over $100 million. The hole in the accounts grew larger and larger, and the forged statements had to show bigger and bigger fictional balances. Wasendorf used the stolen money for everything: company expansions, PFG opened offices, hired staff, bought expensive technology, his personal lifestyle, luxury cars, a large home, expensive hobbies. He fancied himself a restaurateur and opened high-end restaurants in Cedar Falls that consistently lost money. He poured stolen customer funds into these vanity projects. His employees had no idea. His own son, Russell Jr., who became president of PFG, had no idea. The company appeared successful, growing, profitable. Nobody looked at the books closely enough to see that the success was built on a foundation of theft and forgery. But maintaining the lie became increasingly difficult. Every month, Wasendorf had to intercept the real bank statements before anyone else saw them. He created an elaborate system using a P.O. box. He'd arranged years earlier for U.S. Bank to mail statements to a specific P.O. box that only he had access to. He'd collect the mail, take it to his office, forge the statements, and distribute the fake versions. For 20 years, this worked. 20 years of monthly forgeries, 20 years of federal audits that he passed by showing fake documents, 20 years of stealing from customers who had absolutely no idea their money was vanishing. You might be wondering, didn't customers notice? If Wasendorf was stealing their money, wouldn't their account balances be wrong? Here's the devious genius of his scheme. He wasn't stealing from individual customer accounts in a way they'd notice. The segregated accounts at U.S. Bank held all customer funds in aggregate. Individual customers would see their account balances on PFG's internal systems, which Wasendorf controlled. Those balances were accurate. They showed what customers should have. The problem was that the money that was supposed to back up those balances wasn't actually in the bank. It was like a bank running a fractional reserve scam. Customer A's statement shows $100,000. Customer B's shows $200,000. But instead of $300,000 in the bank, There's only $100,000 because Wasendorf stole the rest. As long as all the customers don't try to withdraw their money at once, nobody realizes the money isn't there. This works until it doesn't. Until something breaks. Until someone asks the wrong question, or checks the wrong document, or gets suspicious about why the CEO is so secretive about certain procedures. For Russell Wasendorf, that moment came in early 2012. The NFA decided to conduct a more thorough audit than usual. After the 2008 financial crisis and the Bernie Madoff scandal, regulators were being more careful, more skeptical. They wanted to dig deeper into PFG's financials. In July 2012, an NFA auditor made a decision that would unravel everything. Instead of just reviewing the bank statements Wasendorf provided, the auditor decided to call U.S. Bank directly to verify the account balances. It was a routine verification call, the kind that should have been happening all along but somehow hadn't in 20 years. The auditor asked the bank, "Can you confirm the balance in Peregrine Financial Group's segregated customer account as of June 30th, 2012? The bank pulled up the records. "Yes, the balance is $5 million. The auditor looked at the statement Wasendorf had provided. It showed $225 million. There was a long pause on the phone call. "I'm sorry," the auditor said. "Can you check that again?" "The balance should be around $225 million. The bank representative checked again. "No, it's definitely $5 million. That's what we show in their segregated account." The auditor felt her stomach drop. A $220 million discrepancy. That wasn't a clerical error. That wasn't a timing issue. That was fraud. She immediately escalated to her supervisors. Within hours, senior NFA officials were on the phone with U.S. Bank, with PFG's lawyers, and with the FBI. By the end of the day, on Friday, July 6, 2012, federal investigators knew that Peregrine Financial Group was missing over $200 million of customer money. They just didn't know where it went yet, or how long this had been happening, or that the CEO was about to try to kill himself. That weekend, Russell Wasendorf Sr. knew it was over. The NFA had asked about the direct bank verification. He'd tried to deflect, but he knew the game was up. 20 years of deception, 20 years of forged statements, 20 years of theft, all about to come crashing down. He went home Saturday night and wrote his confession. 8 pages, single-spaced, detailing everything. How he'd started stealing in 1992. How he'd forged thousands of bank statements over 2 decades. How much money he'd taken. Where it had gone. He wrote about the stress of maintaining the lie, the constant fear of being caught, the way it had consumed his life. "I have committed fraud," he wrote. "For this I feel constant and intense guilt. I have made a terrible mistake, and I apologize for the harm I have caused to everyone who trusted me." Sunday morning, July 8, 2012, Russell Wasendorf drove to a rural area outside Cedar Falls. He parked his car in a closed garage, left the engine running, and waited for the carbon monoxide to end it all. The confession was in his lap. He'd be found dead, and at least everyone would know the truth. But fate, or luck, or divine intervention, depending on your perspective, had other plans. A passerby noticed the closed garage and the running car. They called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes, found Wasendorf unconscious but alive, pulled him out, and rushed him to the hospital. He woke up in a hospital bed, alive, with FBI agents waiting to talk to him. His suicide note confession was now evidence, and the 20-year fraud he'd hoped to escape through death would instead be prosecuted in a federal courtroom. The FBI raided PFG's offices on Monday, July 9th. Employees arrived to find federal agents swarming the building, seizing computers, boxing up documents. Russell Wasendorf Jr. stood in shock as he learned that his father, The man he'd worked beside, respected, admired, had been stealing from customers for his entire career. The FBI agents who walked into Russell Wasendorf's hospital room on July 10, 2012, carried a copy of his suicide confession, 8 pages that detailed 20 years of systematic fraud. They didn't need to interrogate him. He'd already told them everything. Special Agent William Langdon sat beside the hospital bed and read portions of the confession back to Wasendorf, who was awake but groggy, an oxygen tube in his nose, monitors beeping around him. Mr. Wasendorf, in this document you state that you've been forging U.S. bank statements since 1992. Is that accurate? Wasendorf nodded weakly. Yes. And you estimate you've stolen approximately $215 million from customer-segregated accounts over that time period? Yes. Where did the money go? That was the question everyone wanted answered. $215 million doesn't just vanish. It goes somewhere. Prosecutors would spend months tracing the money, but the broad strokes were clear even in those first few days. Company operations. Wasendorf had used customer funds to keep PFG running during lean years, to expand when the company couldn't afford it, to maintain the appearance of success even when the business wasn't profitable. He'd essentially been running a Ponzi scheme, using new customer deposits to cover withdrawals and operations, stealing the difference, covering it all up with forged documents. Personal expenses, luxury vehicles, a large home, expensive travel. Wasendorf had lived well, though not extravagantly compared to some fraudsters. He wasn't buying yachts or private jets, but he'd maintained an upper-middle-class lifestyle funded by stolen money. The restaurants. This was where a massive chunk of the money disappeared. Wasendorf fancied himself a food entrepreneur. He'd opened several high-end restaurants in Cedar Falls, fine dining establishments in a small Iowa town. They consistently lost money. He kept pouring customer funds into these failing ventures, chasing a dream that had nothing to do with commodities trading, real estate investments. Some of the stolen money went into property purchases, both personal and commercial. These assets would later be seized by federal authorities to partially compensate victims. But here's the brutal truth that victims would learn. Most of the money was simply gone. 20 years of theft, spent on operating expenses, lifestyle costs, and failed business ventures. No secret Swiss bank accounts holding $200 million. No treasure waiting to be recovered. Just gone. The FBI arrested Russell Wasendorf Sr. on July 13, 2012. He was charged with lying to federal regulators, the initial charge while prosecutors built their case. He was released on bond, confined to his home with an ankle monitor, his passport surrendered. Meanwhile, the full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Peregrine Financial Group had about 24,000 customer accounts. The segregated accounts that should have held $225 million held only $5 million. That $220 million shortfall meant thousands of people had lost their money. Farmers who'd been hedging their crop prices, small investors who'd been trading commodity futures, retirement accounts, college savings, all of it gone. The company immediately filed for bankruptcy. Trading was suspended. Customer accounts were frozen. The hunt began to recover whatever assets could be found and distribute them to victims. Russell Wasendorf Jr., Russ Jr., as everyone called him, faced his own nightmare. He was president of PFG. He'd worked there for years, and he'd had absolutely no idea his father was running a massive fraud. The FBI investigated Russ Jr. thoroughly. Was he complicit? Did he know? Was this a father-son criminal conspiracy? The evidence clearly showed he didn't know. Wasendorf Sr. had compartmentalized everything. He'd handled the bank statements personally. He'd kept the P.O. box arrangement secret. He'd built walls within the company so that even his own son couldn't see what he was doing. But knowing Russ Jr. was innocent didn't erase the guilt he felt. His father had destroyed thousands of people's financial lives, and he'd been there the whole time, blind to it. The company he'd helped build was a fraud. His career was destroyed. His name was permanently associated with one of the biggest commodity trading frauds in history. In a statement to the media, Russ Jr. said, "I am devastated by this betrayal. My father committed fraud. I had no knowledge of it. I am cooperating fully with investigators, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how the man I thought I knew could do something like this." He never spoke to his father again. As the criminal investigation deepened, a picture emerged of how Wasendorf had maintained the fraud for so long. It wasn't just the forged bank statements. It was a culture of deference, secrecy, and centralized control. Employees described Wasendorf as charismatic but controlling. He made all major decisions. He kept certain information compartmentalized. If someone asked questions about the bank statements or the segregated accounts, he'd give a smooth explanation that satisfied them. After all, he was the founder, the CEO, the expert. Who were they to question him? The P.O. box scheme was particularly clever. Wasendorf had told U.S. Bank years ago to mail all statements to a specific P.O. box for security reasons. He was the only person who had access to that box. He'd collect the mail, take it to his office, and nobody thought twice about it. The CEO picking up the company mail. Perfectly normal, right? What wasn't normal was what he did next. He'd open the real bank statements showing the actual balances, which were always far less than what should be there, and he'd create forgeries. In the early years, he used whiteout and a typewriter. Later, he got more sophisticated. He'd scan the real statements, use Photoshop to alter the numbers, print them on bank-like paper, and create documents that looked perfectly authentic. He became an expert forger over 20 years. He knew exactly how U.S. Bank formatted their statements, what fonts they used, where the logos went, how the numbers aligned. His forgeries were good enough to fool federal auditors repeatedly. But the scheme had a fatal weakness. It required Wasendorf to personally control the mail, personally create the forgeries, personally present them to auditors. If he ever lost control of that process, if someone else picked up the mail, if an auditor called the bank directly, the whole thing would collapse instantly. For 20 years, he maintained that control. And then, in July 2012, an NFA auditor made that phone call to U.S. Bank, and the house of cards fell. The victims began to speak out. There was Tom Henderson, a farmer from Iowa who'd used PFG to hedge his corn and soybean prices. He'd had $340,000 in his account, money he'd saved over decades of farming. It represented his retirement, his security, his peace of mind. All of it gone. "I trusted him," Henderson told reporters, his voice shaking. "Russ Wasendorf was a local guy, Iowa businessman. I thought my money was safe. I thought there were regulations, oversight, protections. How does someone steal for 20 years without anyone noticing?" There was Maria Gonzalez, a schoolteacher from California who'd invested her retirement savings in commodity futures through PFG. She'd been planning to retire in 2 years. Now she'd have to keep working into her 70s. "I'll never recover from this," she said. "At my age, you can't rebuild. The money is gone. My retirement is gone. My dreams are gone." There was James Chen, who'd inherited $500,000 from his parents and invested it through PFG. "That money was supposed to help me start a business," he said. "It was supposed to change my life. Instead, it got stolen by some guy in Iowa who wanted to run restaurants. I'll never see that money again." The stories multiplied. Thousands of victims, each with their own tale of loss. Some had lost their entire savings. Others had lost money they couldn't afford to lose. All of them had trusted a system that was supposed to protect them and had failed spectacularly. The anger wasn't just directed at Wasendorf. People were furious with the NFA. How do you audit a company for 20 years and never catch a fraud this simple? How do you not verify bank statements directly? How do you let this happen? The NFA issued statements defending their audit procedures, but the criticism was valid. The regulatory system had failed, not through malice, but through complacency, through assumptions, through not asking the hard questions. After Madoff, after Enron, after all the financial scandals of the previous decade, people had assumed that regulatory oversight had improved. The Wasendorf case proved that massive frauds could still slip through the cracks if they were conducted by someone who understood the system's weaknesses. Russell Wasendorf Sr.'s mental state deteriorated in the months after his arrest. The man who'd tried to kill himself in a garage was now facing the reality of his crimes. No escape, no easy way out. Just the slow grind of federal prosecution and the knowledge that thousands of people's lives had been destroyed by his actions. In September 2012, federal prosecutors filed additional charges: fraud, embezzlement, making false statements to regulators. The evidence was overwhelming. His own confession, the forged documents, the bank records showing the missing money. There was no defense, no argument that could explain away 20 years of systematic theft. Wasendorf's attorney advised him to plead guilty and cooperate fully. Fighting the charges would only result in a longer sentence and prolong the victim's suffering. On September 17, 2012, Russell Wasendorf Sr. appeared in federal court in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He stood before Judge Linda Reed and pleaded guilty to all charges. His voice was barely above a whisper as he admitted to each count of fraud. Judge Reed asked him directly, "Mr. Wasendorf, you understand that by pleading guilty you're admitting you stole over $200 million from your customers over a period of 20 years?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you understand the severity of these crimes?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you have anything to say to the victims before sentencing?" Wasendorf paused. For a moment it looked like he might break down. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I am deeply sorry." "I know that means nothing. I know words can't undo what I've done. But I want the victims to know that I understand the harm I've caused. I destroyed lives. I destroyed trust. And I will have to live with that knowledge every day for the rest of my life." In the gallery, several victims shook their heads. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't return their money. Sorry didn't give back the years of savings, the retirement plans, the financial security. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for January 2013. While Wasendorf awaited sentencing, bankruptcy trustees worked to recover whatever assets they could find for the victims. They seized his house, his cars, his personal property. They went after the restaurants, selling them or shutting them down. They traced money flows, looking for any hidden assets. The final tally was devastating. Of the $215 million Wasendorf had stolen, they recovered approximately $110 million in various assets and insurance claims. That meant victims would get, on average, about 50 cents on the dollar. If you'd had $100,000 in your PFG account, you'd get back around $50,000, if you were lucky. Many victims got far less. The distribution process was complex, prioritizing certain claims over others. Some people who'd lost everything got back barely 30% of their money. Tom Henderson, the Iowa farmer with $340,000 in his account, received $167,000 in the final distribution. He'd lost $173,000, over half his retirement savings, to Wasendorf's 20-year fraud. "At least I got something," he told a local newspaper. "A lot of people got nothing, but you can't help thinking about what that money meant, what it represented." The years of work that went into saving it, all stolen by one man who wanted to live beyond his means and run restaurants that nobody wanted to eat at. January 31st, 2013. The sentencing hearing. Federal courtroom in Cedar Rapids packed with victims, media, lawyers. Russell Wasendorf Sr., now 64 years old, looking haggard and defeated, standing before Judge Linda Reed. The prosecution presented victim impact statements. Dozens of people who'd lost their savings, their retirement, their financial futures. The statements were heartbreaking. Elderly people who'd have to work until they died. Young families who'd lost their children's college funds. Investors who'd trusted a system that betrayed them. One victim, an elderly man named Robert Preston, addressed Wasendorf directly. "You didn't just steal money. You stole time. You stole the years I should have spent in retirement. You stole my peace of mind. You stole my ability to trust. And for what? So you could run fancy restaurants in Iowa? So you could feel important?" Wasendorf stared at the floor, tears running down his face. The defense presented their case for leniency. Yes, Wasendorf had committed fraud, but he'd also suffered the suicide attempt, the public humiliation, the loss of his family, his reputation, everything he'd built. He was a broken man who posed no future threat to society. Judge Reed listened to both sides. Then she delivered her ruling. "Mr. Wasendorf, you conducted a systematic fraud over 20 years. You stole from thousands of people who trusted you. You forged documents. You lied to federal regulators. You showed a complete disregard for the harm you were causing. The scale and duration of your crimes demand significant punishment." She sentenced Russell Wasendorf Sr. to 50 years in federal prison. 50 years. He was 64 years old. Even with good behavior, he'd be over 100 before he was eligible for release. It was, effectively, a life sentence. Wasendorf showed no reaction, just nodded slightly, as if he'd expected this, as if he knew that 20 years of theft couldn't be answered with anything less than spending the rest of his life in prison. The bailiffs led him away. He didn't look back at the gallery, didn't make eye contact with any of the victims who'd come to watch him be sentenced. He simply shuffled out of the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, chains rattling, and disappeared into the federal prison system. Russell Wasendorf Sr. arrived at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas in February 2013. Federal inmate number 16432-030. 64 years old, serving a 50-year sentence for stealing $215 million over 20 years. He was assigned to a cell in the general population. No special treatment, no protective custody unless he requested it. Just another white-collar criminal in a prison full of fraudsters, drug dealers, and violent offenders. The other inmates knew who he was. Word travels fast in prison, especially about high-profile cases. Some of them had respect for the audacity of his crime, 20 years of forgery without getting caught. Others had contempt. He'd stolen from regular people, farmers, retirees, folks just trying to make it. Wasendorf kept to himself. He worked in the prison library, just like countless fraudsters before him. He attended religious services. He wrote letters that mostly went unanswered. His ex-wife, Lori, had divorced him. His son, Russ Jr., never visited, never wrote. The man who'd once been a respected Iowa businessman with a family and a company was now completely alone. In a letter to a journalist in 2014, Wasendorf wrote, "Every day I wake up and remember what I did. Every day I think about the people I hurt. There's no escape from that. Not in here, not anywhere. The guilt is my real prison sentence. But guilt doesn't pay back stolen money. Guilt doesn't restore retirement savings. Guilt doesn't undo 20 years of systematic fraud. The victims had to rebuild their lives without him caring about his guilt." The aftermath of the Peregrine financial collapse rippled through the commodities trading industry for years. It wasn't just about one man's fraud. It was about the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. The National Futures Association faced intense scrutiny. How had they audited PFG for 20 years without catching the fraud? The answer was uncomfortable. They'd relied too heavily on documentation provided by the firm itself. They'd assumed that bank statements were legitimate. They'd trusted when they should have verified. In response, the NFA completely overhauled their audit procedures. New rules required direct bank confirmations. Auditors now had to verify segregated account balances directly with banks, not just review statements provided by the firm. This single change would have caught Wasendorf's fraud immediately. More frequent audits. High-risk firms would face quarterly audits instead of annual ones. Surprise inspections. Some audits would be unannounced, giving firms no time to prepare fake documents. Enhanced document verification. Auditors received training to spot forged documents, to check for inconsistencies, to be more skeptical. These changes came too late for PFG's victims, but they would protect future customers. The Wasendorf case became a textbook example of regulatory failure, taught in business schools, discussed in compliance seminars, studied by anyone working in financial oversight. One NFA official, speaking anonymously to a trade publication, said, "We failed. There's no other way to say it. We had procedures that should have worked, but they relied on trust. Wasendorf exploited that trust perfectly. Now we verify everything. Trust no one." It's a harsh lesson, but necessary. The victims tried to move on with their lives, though moving on meant something different for each person. Tom Henderson, the Iowa farmer, sold part of his land to cover the losses from PFG. He didn't retire when he'd planned. At 68 years old, he was still working, still farming, trying to rebuild what Wasendorf had stolen. "I'll die on this land," he told a local reporter in 2015. "Not because I want to work until I drop, but because I can't afford to stop. That's Wasendorf's legacy for me." Maria Gonzalez, the California schoolteacher, took a part-time job tutoring to supplement her income. Retirement was pushed back indefinitely. "I'm 72 now," she said in 2016. "I should be traveling, spending time with my grandchildren. Instead, I'm still working because one man decided to steal my future. You don't recover from that. You just endure it." James Chen, who'd lost his inheritance, started over from scratch. He took a job in finance, ironically, working in compliance for a major brokerage firm. "I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to other people," he explained. "I can't get my money back, but maybe I can prevent the next Wasendorf." Some victims never recovered. There were reports of divorces caused by the financial strain, health problems worsened by stress, dreams abandoned because the money to pursue them was gone. A few victims died in the years after the fraud, and their families wondered if the stress had shortened their lives. One victim's daughter wrote an op-ed in 2017. "My father died of a heart attack 3 years after losing his life savings in the PFG fraud. The doctors said it was cardiovascular disease. I say Russell Wasendorf killed my father as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. The stress, the anxiety, the crushing realization that he'd been betrayed, it destroyed him. He was never the same after losing that money. And now he's gone." Meanwhile, civil lawsuits multiplied. Victims sued everyone they could think of who might bear some responsibility for their losses. They sued U.S. Bank for not detecting the fraud. The bank settled for an undisclosed amount, likely a few $1,000,000 split among thousands of victims. A drop in the bucket. They sued the NFA for negligent auditing. Those lawsuits were largely unsuccessful. Federal regulations protected the NFA from most liability claims. They sued PFG's accounting firm for failing to catch the fraud during their audits. That case settled for approximately $13 million. Every settlement helped, but none of them came close to making victims whole. If you'd lost $100,000, you might have recovered $50,000 from the bankruptcy distribution, another $5,000 from the U.S. bank settlement, maybe $2,000 from the accounting firm settlement. You'd still be down $43,000, money you'd never see again. The legal process took years and cost millions in attorney fees. Many victims simply gave up, accepting their losses and trying to move forward with their lives rather than spending more years fighting through the courts. Back in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the city that Wasendorf had called home for decades, his legacy was complicated. On one hand, he'd been a major employer. PFG had provided hundreds of jobs in a small town where good jobs were precious. Those jobs disappeared when the company collapsed. The modern office building PFG had occupied sat empty for years before being sold at a loss. On the other hand, many Cedar Falls residents had been victims of the fraud. Local farmers, small investors, people who'd trusted their hometown success story. They felt betrayed not just financially, but personally. He'd been one of them, an Iowa guy who'd made it big, and he'd used that hometown trust to steal from them. The fancy restaurants Wasendorf had opened with stolen money closed one by one. They'd never really fit Cedar Falls anyway. Too upscale, too expensive for a town where a nice dinner meant a steakhouse or an Italian place. They'd been Wasendorf's vanity projects, his attempt to be something more than a commodities trader. One of those restaurants, a French-style bistro, was turned into a Mexican restaurant by new owners. The transformation felt symbolic somehow. The pretentious dream built on stolen money replaced by something honest and unpretentious. A Cedar Falls resident named Sarah Mitchell told a journalist in 2018, "We want to forget about Russell Wasendorf. But we can't. His fraud is part of our town's history now. The fancy businessman who stole millions. It's embarrassing. It's painful. And it's a reminder to be skeptical of people who seem too successful, too perfect." As the years passed, Russell Wasendorf faded from public consciousness. His case was studied in business schools and compliance courses, but most Americans forgot his name. He became just another entry in the long list of financial fraudsters, smaller than Madoff, less flamboyant than the Enron executives, but still significant. In prison, Wasendorf aged rapidly. The stress of his crimes, the suicide attempt, the imprisonment, it all took a toll. By his 70th birthday in 2019, he looked closer to 80. His health deteriorated. Prison medical care kept him alive, but he was a shell of the charismatic businessman who'd once commanded respect in Cedar Falls. He gave one interview in 2016, speaking with a true crime writer researching a book about commodities fraud. In that interview, Wasendorf tried to explain his thinking. "I didn't wake up one day and decide to steal $200 million. It happened gradually, a little bit at first, just to cover a shortfall, then a little more to cover the first theft, then more to cover those. It's like being caught in quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. After a few years, I wasn't even thinking about it as stealing anymore. It was just how things worked. The forged statements were part of my routine, like brushing my teeth or checking email." The writer asked if he felt remorse. "Every day. But remorse doesn't fix anything. The people I hurt, they don't care if I feel bad about it. They want their money back. They want their lives back. And I can't give them that. So my remorse is meaningless. It's just me feeling sorry for myself in prison while they're out there dealing with the consequences of what I did." That interview was the last time Russell Wasendorf spoke publicly. He's still alive as of 2025, serving his 50-year sentence. He'll be 114 years old when he's eligible for release. He'll die in prison, almost certainly. There will be no redemption arc, no early release, no heartwarming story of rehabilitation. Just an old man in a prison cell, living with the consequences of 20 years of systematic theft. So, what are the lessons from the Peregrine Financial scandal? What can we learn from Russell Wasendorf's 20-year fraud? First, trust, but verify. Reagan said it about the Soviets, but it applies to finance too. Wasendorf's fraud succeeded because regulators trusted documents instead of verifying them directly. That single phone call to U.S. Bank in 2012, the one that finally exposed the fraud, should have happened in 1993, 1995, 2000, 2005. It didn't because people assumed a respected CEO wouldn't lie. Now, post-Wasendorf, direct verification is standard. Trust is no longer enough. Second, simple frauds can be the most effective. Wasendorf didn't use complex derivatives or offshore shell corporations. He used whiteout and a photocopier. The simplicity of his scheme is what made it work for so long. Complex frauds attract scrutiny. Simple frauds that exploit basic assumptions can go undetected for decades. Third, the cover-up escalates the crime. Wasendorf probably stole a few $100,000 that first year in 1992. If he'd stopped, confessed, and paid it back, he'd have faced penalties, but not prison. Instead, he covered it up with forged statements. That led to more theft to cover the first theft, more forgeries to hide the growing hole. By the time he was caught, he'd stolen $215 million and faced a life sentence. The cover-up is often worse than the crime. Fourth, fraud destroys more than money. The victims of PFG didn't just lose dollars. They lost security, retirement, dreams, trust, peace of mind. Some lost their health. Some lost years of their lives to stress and worry. Financial fraud has psychological victims too. The harm extends far beyond account balances. Fifth, there's no escape. Wasendorf tried to kill himself rather than face consequences. He failed. Now he's in prison for life, which is arguably worse than death for a man his age. There's no escaping the consequences of systematic fraud. You either get caught and go to prison, or you live in constant fear of being caught. Neither option is freedom. If you've followed this story from the beginning, you've witnessed how one man's decision to steal, just a little bit at first, just to cover a temporary shortfall, spiraled into a 20-year fraud that destroyed thousands of lives. Russell Wasendorf wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a businessman who saw an opportunity, took it, and then couldn't stop. The theft became routine. The forgeries became second nature. The lies became his reality. And everyone around him, his employees, his son, his regulators, his customers, they all trusted him because he seemed trustworthy, because he was a pillar of the community, because nobody imagined that a respected Iowa businessman could be systematically stealing millions. That trust was his greatest asset and his most powerful weapon. Margaret Chen noticed the discrepancies at St. Timothy's Church and caught Father Martinez after 8 years. The NFA auditor made that phone call to U.S. Bank and caught Wasendorf after 20 years. Both frauds succeeded because nobody asked the hard questions soon enough. Both ended because someone finally did. Somewhere tonight, in some office or church or investment firm, someone is making the same choice Wasendorf made in 1992. They're taking money that isn't theirs, telling themselves it's temporary, planning to pay it back. They're creating the first forgery, the first altered statement, the first lie. And they're betting that nobody will ask the hard questions, that nobody will verify directly. That trust will be enough to cover their tracks. Most of the time, they're wrong. But sometimes, too often, they're right. And the fraud continues for years or decades until someone finally asks, "Can you verify these numbers directly with the source?" Russell Wasendorf spent 20 years hoping nobody would ask that question. On July 6, 2012, someone finally did. And 20 years of lies collapsed in a single phone call.